Pakistan is highly critical of the U.S. over Washington's recent drone strikes in Balochistan province, calling it a violation of its sovereignty. Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif said U.S. officials did not inform Pakistani authorities about the raid aimed at killing the Taliban leader. The criticism came after a senior White House official said both Islamabad and Kabul were notified shortly after the attack. Earlier, though, senior Afghan Taliban sources confirmed the death of their chief Mullah Akhtar Mansoor in the drone attack. They said a council meeting is underway to decide Mansoor's successor. With us to talk about this is investigative journalist Tony Gosling. Tony, good to have you with us. Now, in terms of the Pakistani stances, to what extent do you think of the Islamabad position when it says that these attacks should not have taken place? To what extent do you think Nawaz Sharif's remarks are justified?
Well, of course he's right. This is a total violation of sovereignty. This is something that Obama seems to do every morning before he gets up for breakfast. Violating sovereignty, violating the UN Charter. The Americans seem to think they can go into any country and do anything to anyone, including sometimes even here in Europe. So this is no surprise, of course, that the Pakistani leadership were absolutely right to call out Obama. This Taliban leader, Mullah Mansoor, has been killed in Pakistan. But you see, if you look at what's been going on in Afghanistan since the 1980s, it rather mirrors US foreign policy in Asia in places like Vietnam beforehand, where most of the real activity behind the scenes seems to be to try and control and destabilize the region, and also to ensure the cultivation of opium and poppies in Afghanistan, and that was largely what the Vietnam War was about as well. And that was one of the reasons that President Kennedy was assassinated back in 1963. So you can see there's a much bigger picture here to this one incident. It is a perfect example of why there needs to be some real international law in the world, and why the Pakistanis are absolutely right to call the Americans out. In fact, it's largely American journalists, including Glenn Greenwald and his partner down in Brazil, exiles from America, journalist exiles, if you want, who have done some of the best work on exposing these drone assassinations. On the Intercept website, for example, people can read something called the Drone Papers, which gives a deep insight into the massive criminality going on, where people are just being taken out in various parts of the world. But also, remember, in 1980, the Americans were in Afghanistan, weren't they, helping the Mujahideen, who then later became these, what they call now, more extremist Muslims. And that suited the Americans then, because it was about destabilizing the country to get the Russians out of Afghanistan. And the Americans seem to do this in Syria too, changing their mind as to whether they really support the rebels or not, with the Al-Qaeda and ISIS suddenly deciding that there are factions that they don't wish to support anymore. So it's total hypocrisy from America.
Tony, now you gave us this bigger picture. If we could zero in from this bigger picture to a smaller one and to the event at hand, to what extent do you think America's strategy here in taking out the head, the top man in the Taliban, has been effective in basically degrading and defeating Taliban? Obviously, we understand that there's going to be a successor and there's going to be splinter groups here, and they will be out there to avenge his death. What good has this done?
Well, actually, no good at all. I'll tell you what, in some regimes around the world, which are totalitarian style regimes, where they're not representing the people at all, like, for example, in Saudi Arabia, where there's a monarchy, if the king dies or is removed or is killed or whatever, what happens is there's a massive scrabble for power. In places like Afghanistan, this doesn't happen because you've got a leadership amongst the Taliban that do largely represent large numbers of people. So you've got literally scores of people who may take over from Mullah Mansoor. And it's going to be the sort of process that they would have been prepared for, ready for. The same sort of thing that you get in a decent democratic country is you've got a whole leadership who are basically of a similar mind and similar mindset. So this is going to make absolutely no difference whatsoever. I don't think there's going to be the sort of power struggle that you would get in somewhere like Saudi Arabia, for example, if the leader was gone. But what it does do is it creates more terrorists. All serious academics around the world understand now that these drone strikes actually create more terrorists than they kill. Obviously, they're killing often civilians with these strikes, particularly the hideous double tap drone strikes, where when people come and try and help, there's another Hellfire missile comes to kill those who are trying to aid those who are dying. And this just creates more hatred. And I think, you know, this is exactly what the US wants with these strikes. This is what it's trying to create. It's trying to create more and more hatred for them, and actually to recruit, bring more people in to the fight, because that's a fight the Americans ultimately think that they can win. Let me just remind you, though, here in Britain, some important news over the last week or so is that the drone strikes could leave all those involved in them in Britain facing murder charges. So the situation in Britain with those drone strikes which have been ordered, much fewer, of course, than by the United States, it looks like some of them, including possibly even the Prime Minister, could end up in jail for them.
And Tony, very briefly in 30 seconds, if you could. Now, what kind of an impact would this have on the supposed peace talks and the let's say, expansion with the central Afghan government, the Taliban talks with them?
The only real thing I can see, having had a good look at this, is that there's been an announcement as well over the last couple of days, possibly just today, that NATO is going to extend its Afghan mission beyond 2016. Now, look, we were told back in 2001 they were going to be in there for a few months. Yeah, so it's now 15 years since the NATO decided to have its mission in Afghanistan. It's time those people all came home, because the peace talks is where the only real peace can be put together. The trouble is, some of those people at the peace talks don't want peace.
That's the trouble. Thank you so much, Tony Gosling.